Failing to plan is planning to fail. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. We're heading into a very important presidential election in Sri Lanka. People have been waiting for an election for a long time. We've had elections postponed time and time again. But finally, it seems like a time to exercise our franchise is coming about. Now, this is coming about in the midst of an economic crisis that we're still reeling from. There are various factions that claim that Sri Lanka is stable to a certain point now. We just finished the second review under the IMF Extended Fund Facility. We've got a report on that. We have several reports that have gone deep in to Sri Lanka's economic crisis and analyzed what really happened here, and more importantly, what can be done to bring Sri Lanka out of this situation. Now, to discuss these matters and much more, as always, we've got an expert panel here on Face the Nation. Starting off on my right-hand side, we've got Bram Nicholas. He's an economist, no stranger to the program. Thank you very much, Bram, for joining us on our program this evening. On his right, we've got Arshad Ismail, an economist from the Frontier Research. Thank you very much, Arshad, for joining us on our program. On his right, we've got Lasil De Silva, also no stranger to the program. He is the former Director of Administration of Parliament. Thank you very much, Mr. De Silva, for joining us on our program this evening. And last and certainly not least, we've got Kusum Vijayathilaka, a member of the Working Committee of the Samagi Janabalavegia. Very good evening, Kusum. Thank you very much for taking time off your busy schedule, especially with an election upcoming. So, to start off today's discussion, of course, one of the most important things that Sri Lanka as a country was looking forward to, or we were kind of hinging our bets on, was this IMF facility, because that seems to be what we're running on at the moment. The second review was coming up. There were discussions, or there was a thought process that since we haven't finalized on the creditors' agreement, how much would that affect the second review? But Sri Lanka seems to have passed that boundary. So I'd like to start off with Brahms on what really happened in the second review of the IMF. There are, of course, the government now claims that they've, in the 2 years that followed the ousting of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, that they've tried and brought some stability into Sri Lanka. But IMF in this case at least seems to be an independent third party kind of overseeing and reviewing things that's happening in Sri Lanka. What can you tell us about the second review of the IMF, the report that was published, and what it really says about how we're doing as a country right now?
Yeah, it seems like either me or my dad is always brought on to do some good old IMF bashing, so I'll get straight to it. No, but in all seriousness, having had a look at the IMF report, the most recent one, that came out a few days ago or a week ago, I have three main points of concern, and two of them are points I feel that the IMF is giving importance to and the government seems to be giving importance to. The first is that inflation has been brought back under control. That's the way it's being phrased. Now, what I'd like to remind everyone of is this bombshell report that was released by the central bank itself 2 months ago, where they have now shown that the inflation that was caused in 2022 and 2021, that massive spike in inflation, was mostly supply side caused. Do you know what that means? That means that all these discussions we had about printing money causing inflation were actually completely wrong. Because supply side inflation, it comes from things like raw material costs and the exchange rate, basically the costs of production that are putting upward pressure on inflation. So when now the IMF is congratulating the government with having brought inflation down, they should have a look and discuss with the central bank report itself, because it seems like they're not on the same, reading from the same page there. The other thing is, the second thing is debt sustainability seems to be really big still. You know, it seems to be the main thing the IMF is congratulating the government on. for moving in the right direction, but I have two concerns there. The first is the massive interest burden that the Sri Lankan government still carries. And this is basically the interest it's paying on government debt. It's one of the highest ratios in the world. And what I mean with ratio is half of the government's total spending is now on interest payments.
But Brahms, isn't that what our government agreed to? I mean, nobody came in, forced us to take these, be it be it between governments or from private creditors. Nobody forced us to really take on this debt. It was the government that mismanaged and took on this debt. And when we have an issue with debt sustainability, isn't that what we need to address, and isn't that what the IMF doing?
Actually, why I raise this point is because this has been going on for 40 years. That's how long the Sri Lankan government has been saddled with such a high interest burden. For 40 years, it's been twice as large as any other developing country on average. And I mean that as a ratio to total spending. So that burden is massive. Now we're talking 3 times the average developing country. And this is being ignored because what we're mainly looking at is the primary deficit, which ignores the interest burden. And I think there should be real concern about how this interest burden is going to be reduced, especially in context of the Central Bank Act, which prevents thing about the debt sustainability analysis is by framing it in this way, we have no longer divided external debt and domestic debt. And I'll tell you why that's important is because they're completely different, servicing them completely different. For the external debt, we need foreign exchange earnings, we need exports, tourism income, remittances. That's where it mainly comes from. So when they are framing it as a debt sustainability problem, my concern is no one is talking about where the foreign exchange earnings are coming from to service the foreign debt, which was what Sri Lanka defaulted on, not the domestic debt. And here, if you look at the IMF report, what they're saying is even though they acknowledge that most of the outflows on the current account, most of the outflows of dollars are caused by the trade deficit, they say, don't worry, that will be compensated for by tourism and remittances. I ask you, where were those inflows during the 3 years of crisis, COVID, the Easter bombings, and after that, the ousting of the president? All of that caused those two to collapse. Tourism collapsed. Remittances collapsed. Exports were the only one still standing. So why isn't any more done to develop this? Because I'll tell you, it's the same level as it was in 2018. No growth since then. And the last 12 years, we've only seen 13% growth. Do you know how much Vietnamese exports have grown in that same time? 266%. I mean, it's insane to think that the government is not doing more to promote exports to get debt sustainability on foreign debt. That's my main concern. And I'll end it there, even though I have some other concerns about growth. Perhaps we can visit them later.
Definitely, Brahms. We'll get into that as the discussion progresses. Now, I'd also like to pose a similar line of questioning to Arshad Ismail, economist from Frontier Research. Arshad, how do you see this second review of the IMF? Is it a true depiction of what Sri Lanka is actually going through? Have they missed the point, what Brahms said?
So I think in terms of, I'm a little more positive than what Brahm was. So I think the report itself, it highlights and shows certain economic developments that have come through. So we've, I think as a nation, we've seen some positives. I don't have to be very negative about things. So we've seen inflation coming under control, as Brahms talked about. We've seen interest rates being controlled. We've seen the exchange rate appreciate also, something that I think at one point we never expected to happen.
So the dollar is back at 310
yes.
last time I checked.
I'm talking about, let's say, from the beginning of the year.
Okay.
Right? So that's good signs. So I think the IMF report also highlights those things. So it starts off with the whole positivity things, but also it highlights certain risks that we'll have to look out for. On one end, like was also pointed out below, the high levels of domestic debt. So will that be something that Sri Lanka can sustain going forward is again a question, something that the IMF also is very explicit about and has highlighted. On the other end, we have an election coming up. So what would the sentiment be going forward? So that's again something that we'll have to look out for. And also the IMF report gives a bit of, I would say, leeway on how the external debt restructuring is progressing. So broadly, if I'm to tell you what the report highlights, I think there is again a bit of a positive message, but again also a few risks to look out for on the EDR side, on elections, the high domestic debt. So all are, I would say, a bit of concerns. Hopefully we can manage through that period. Sri Lanka should be doing well, let's say, in the years to come.
But Bram's main contention, at least regarding this report, is that it's really missed the point. Do you think they've missed the point?
Broadly, I feel they've not really missed the point, right? I think the IMF itself, I think in certain areas, in terms of even, let's say, targets that the IMF has imposed, certain targets, yes, misses the point a bit, right? Now, for example, I would say even targets of the debt to GDP. Right? So there's been debates on social media, there have been debates publicly put as to, is that a really sustainable number? Because at the end of the IMF program, we're looking at a debt target of still 95% of GDP. So is that something that Sri Lanka can sustain going forward? There's been talks about, again, the IMF growth targets being a little low. So there is a bit of, I would say, a mismatch on how the IMF is looking at Sri Lanka also, but I feel broadly the message is in line.
Thank you very much, Arshad Ismail, economist from Frontier Research. We now move on to Lester De Silva, former Director of Administration at no other place than Parliament. Thank you very much, Mr. De Silva, for joining us on our program. And I'd like to ask you, speaking on the IMF targets that have been set, in addition to these economic targets, they've also set governance targets. This is one area that the IMF has put specific focus on. Sri Lanka is considered as one of the first where they've done this broad governance diagnostic report. We had a report done previously, just before the IMF report was released, by Sri Lanka's very own civil society. So as far as identifying the problem here in Sri Lanka goes and proposing solutions, we've got quite a lot of them. But even when you look at the IMF targets that have been set, that Sri Lanka is now bound to follow since we're on the IMF program, some of the most simplest things that could be done by the government, some of the steps that they can take immediately are regarding transparency, are regarding good governance. But even when dealing with the IMF, the government doesn't seem to be giving too much priority to these, because those requirements on transparency, on combating corruption, seems to be the ones that have not been fulfilled by the government. Why do you think that is?
I think it's a very good question. I think I'm very happy to speak about governance because I'm not an economist for that matter. Now, my way of looking at the whole thing, like what you said, it's about this governance diagnostic report. Actually, it's a very nice report. It contains all the recommendations in order to put the country on the right track. Start with, now, even President said that he is taking all the necessary steps to do everything in compliance with this report. But my doubt is, basically, governance, as you said very correctly, involves a lot of things. I mean, legislation, transparency, creation of whatever, separation of powers, all that. Now, basic problem what I see, they have not addressed, though the IMF had wanted. Let's talk about the laws, enactment of laws, right? There were a number of laws they had recommended in this. And actually, they speak about even repealing of certain laws. Unfortunately, even that has not been done. I would love to start with that. Now, in 2008, there was an act, Strategic Development Projects. In my view, that was an act established, I think, by the Parliament for politicians to rob. Maybe because of that reason, they have recommended in their report to repeal that law. Now, this is what it says. Abolish or suspend application of Strategic Development Projects Act until promulgation of explicit and transparent processes for evaluation of proposals and costing the investment promotion conditions. So basically, even the IMF had gone into all that and recommended, right? But unfortunately, with regard to setting up of laws, there are certain other laws that are needed, like National Planning Act. Now, it's one of the most important recommendations they have made here in this. So far, they have never taken action with regard to the enactment of a National Planning Act and also procurement legal framework. Now, in our country, I also want to mention, this matter had been taken up for discussion for years. By the 19th Amendment, they proposed the Procurement Commission. By the 20th Amendment, it was repealed. So you can imagine the kind of thinking in our country. What we really need, a strong governance system, a model established. For that purpose, they need to go into all this and take necessary steps, if possible, to enact these laws. Now look at public assets management, fiscal management. Now, again, about this conflict interest. There is so much here in this report. Nothing of the sort has been taken up. With regard to even auditing, all what I say is it is all because the state in some form of capture. Unfortunately, they have not addressed that issue. Unless you address the issue of state capture, you will never be able to put the country on the right track. I wonder whether they are trying to deceive even the IMF for that matter, right? We have a duty to tell the people, unless you implement most of the recommendations that are here, a very good report, right? We will never be able to achieve. Now, in one of the speeches when President said in Parliament, he said Sri Lanka has stabilized under IMF deal, sustainable growth, next step. I don't think we are on a kind of a sustainable path until now, even with regard to debt or even with regard to other issues in the country, in regard to laws, as I said. The biggest problem, we have nothing concrete done, even with regard to that issue. I would love to take it up at later
Definitely,
stage.
Mr. De Silva, we will get into those matters as we progress in our discussion here today on Face the Nation.
Yeah.
Finally, we turn to the opening statement from Kusum Vijayatilaka, Working Committee member from the Samagijana Balawege, the only person, of course, on the panel today with a political affiliation. Now, Kusum, speaking about really taking the country forward from where we are right now, we've seen governments come and go, promising the sun and the moon to the general public of Sri Lanka. But really it comes down right now to what can actually be done. Now, I know it's not the most popular thing to tell people the truth, especially during the run-up to an election, maybe tell them how grim the situation is and what kind of hardships they might have to face. But speaking on what the SJB really plans on doing now, everybody claims that they have the best plan. But as of today, we have only seen a very limited scope of these plans. We've not seen the full picture that I believe is to come out with the SJB's official manifesto at the presidential election. But of course, you being a member of the working committee would have a good understanding of what's in it. I won't ask you for the specifics, but in your honest opinion, do you think it's actually workable?
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me on Face the Nation. Once again, it's a pleasure to be here. In terms of the SJB's forward-looking policies, there's a number of things to consider, right? First of all, you have to consider the IMF program as it is. Now, there's a lot of commentary that states that the IMF program cannot be negotiated or renegotiated. But I think that's a misunderstanding of what you mean by renegotiation. Now, for example, the IMF has given us 3-4 broad targets, right? So a primary account surplus of 2.3% of GDP, reduce foreign debt service from 9% of GDP to 4.5% of GDP. Total debt to GDP, I think one of my colleagues mentioned, should come down to 95% of GDP by 2032. So these are broad targets, right? So no one is saying So the idea of these targets is that if we achieve these targets by the stipulated period of time in this period of years, our debt will be sustainable. So first of all, we have to check if that claim is accurate. And for that, you have to go into the IMF's debt sustainability model, the assumptions they've made for our debt restructurings. You have to look at the growth that they've looked at, the currency appreciation or depreciation that they've looked at. So there's a whole host of things to consider. And one of the things I think is most telling is how we went about the debt restructuring. Because remember, the debt restructuring is a big part of debt sustainability, right? There is no debt sustainability unless you restructure this debt. And restructuring means primarily a haircut of some sort, right? Now, I would like to get to that a little later on in my comments, because you have to look at how these targets have been set, what is the rationale for them, and whether that rationale sort of reconciles Sri Lanka's realities, our economic realities, okay? So we talked about, some of my colleagues talked about the governance diagnostic report, right? So we all broadly know what governance means. Something that is not in this, it is in the governance report, but it's not explicit. What is one of the main problems around governance? It's a concentration of power. Now, I'll go into, I've noted the parts that discusses it, and I'll quote it later on in my comments. But I think we can accept that a concentration of power is part of the reason why our country collapsed, because there were bad policies brought in by yes men who did not take any responsibility on the cabinet, and they let a president who is neither an expert on economics, neither a financial expert, he's not an agricultural expert, but they let his broad thinking end up as national policy, and that's how the country crashed. Currently, we are in the middle of a financial crisis, we're in the middle of debt restructurings, and we're talking about governance. The IMF, as the institution, is telling us about governance. But the president of the country is also the finance minister. He's also the defense minister. And if that's not a concentration of power, three very broad, powerful parts of the government, if that's not a concentration of power, I'm not sure what is, right? So on one side, he's negotiating apparently as the main negotiator alongside Governor Nandalal with the IMF. On the other side, he's also the president of the country who's enacting all sorts of other laws and basically the leader of this cabinet. So I think that is one thing that we have to honestly say, why hasn't the governance diagnostic report pointed this out explicitly? Because they've mentioned that it's not a good idea for the president and the finance minister to be the same thing. They've said that in the governance report. But at the time of the governance diagnostic report being published, that is exactly the case in Sri Lanka. So why wasn't that mentioned explicitly, right? So that's one. Another issue, I think that we talked about good signs in this latest review, okay? But one of the things on the first page, if you read, we've met all these certain financial targets. I don't think we've met the revenue targets, but I'd like to be corrected by one of my colleagues here. One of the targets we just missed was the social spending ceiling. The IMF told us there is a minimum amount you have to spend on social spending. What is that minimum amount? 0.07% of GDP. Now, even that is a very low percentage by South Asian standards, and remember that the South Asian standards on social spending are far below the rest of the world. Usually are looking at 1%, 1.5%, 2% of GDP spent on social services. Sri Lanka, 0.7% given by the IMF, which is apparently a neo-colonial institution which is trying to suppress our countries, but we couldn't even reach their very low target for social spending. Okay, and that is given in the diagnostic report, in the review that just came out. And similarly, I think if you give me 2 minutes, Sri Lanka's next 10, 15 years is dependent on what we do right now. Okay, this next 1 year is going to matter more than most moments in our history. And right now what we have is, we have two sides of this coin. On one side, the IMF is evil, neo-imperial, trying to extract from our economy. On the other side, the IMF is the perfect economic policy arbiter, right? So I just want people to understand those are two different points of view. And I won't give you my point of view on the IMF. I will repeat what internationally recognized economists have mentioned later on in my comments. We recently had a social activist group called Yukti that brought down a professor of economics with a PhD from the University of Cambridge, Jayati Ghosh, a former finance minister and also a PhD holder from the University of Brown, Martin Guzman. And they gave us a fantastic presentation on some different way of thinking about the IMF and how to look at debt sustainability, and I'll come to their critique. I'd also like to bring up the critique of Brad Sester and Theo Marais, who are senior economists one is attached to the Council on Foreign Relations, which is not a leftist think tank. Anyone can go Google the Council on Foreign Relations. They have a critique of this exact issue that I was talking about, the debt sustainability framework and the analysis that the IMF uses. I would like to discuss that. And more generally, there have been decades of critique of the IMF from Nobel Prize winning economists, Joseph Stiglitz, for instance. Jeffrey Sachs is another PhD holder from the University of Columbia, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. They've made these critiques. Brahm has made the critique as well. So there is a good faith critique to be had about the IMF and about our program. But what about this IMF program? But what worries me is that we don't see that good faith critique. What we see is political pandering on one side or the other. Now, I would accept that the government has achieved some level of stability, but at what cost, right? Rising inequality, poverty has doubled. We are one of the most unequal societies in Southeast Asia. We have mass corruption still. You mentioned the Strategic Development Projects Act, which was only removed last year in October, I believe, which is almost 2 years after the government came into power. We had projects launched under that very scheme just a few months before that, right? We have unsolicited projects galore. Procurement, a lack of transparency. So I don't want to paint a completely negative picture of the audience, but I have to tell you not what I think, but what other people have written, and I'd like the chance to expand on those.
Thank you very much, Kusum Vijaythilaka, Working Committee member of the Samagichana Balavegya. The floor is now open for questions from our journalists. On my right, we've got Niresh Eliathambi, and on my left, Nadeem Majid. Gentlemen, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Shalan. Bram, I'd actually like to start with you. I mean, you and both Kusum as well. Let's not beat around the bush. The IMF is an institution doing what it was designed to do, right? And anyone who engages with institutions of that nature need to understand those basics, those fundamentals. This is what they want. This is what they're going to push for. But what really concerns me in Sri Lanka's, as a citizen, what really concerns me is the apparent lack of responsibility and agency on our part in how we deal with these institutions. Whether it's the IMF, whether it's in our bilateral relations with more powerful countries, including with India, China, whether it's BRICS, because we seem to be looking for a savior somewhere. And some people think if it's not the IMF, then BRICS will save us, or someone else will save us, or God will descend from the heavens and save us. What's really concerning to me is that among the policymakers, legislators, politicians in Sri Lanka, and even among officials, there is a lack of responsibility and agency. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think what you might be getting at, which is something I've felt as well, is the need for, there's a term for it in economics, it's economic nationalism. The solution has to come from within. And I think I agree with Kusum on this point that you have to be practical. You can't just go slandering the IMF and saying, okay, we're not going to work with them because we don't like what they have to say. The reality at the moment is you have to work with them, you have to negotiate. And again, I agree with Kusum. I think you can renegotiate because this is what we've seen with examples like South Korea and Vietnam. They have actually been working with the IMF while introducing their own policies that didn't necessarily gel well with what the IMF framework is all about. I'm talking about industrialization policies. So this is never in any IMF report, yet South Korea in 1997 and Vietnam in 2006. When they both were negotiating with the IMF, they continued with their policies. They gave up some of their policies, which they thought were not essential for their main strategy.
So that's what I'm talking about, right? The reason that good examples of Vietnam and South Korea, even while working with the IMF, they were able to put forward, on the one hand, their own policies of, as you say, maybe an economic nationalism, to promote an economic nationalism. I don't see that kind of agency from the negotiators, economists, policymakers in Sri Lanka. That, okay, we are also going to do these things parallelly. These are the parallel reforms that it feels that they're happy, they're like a patient, the IMF is the doctor, they're happy to take the prescription, just take the medicine on the prescription and make no lifestyle changes whatsoever.
Yeah, and that's what worries me is I can't see that much coming out of the policymakers and, for that matter, Sri Lanka's foremost economists that are very different from what the IMF is saying. So my conclusion has to be they're very much talking on the same lines, whereas some constructive criticism might be in order. Now, for me, what has been the problem is the IMF's record. Someone has to point at least one example where their policies have developed a country. Because I've heard the defense that usually the governments don't stick with the IMF policies. Fine, but are you telling me that in over 50 developing countries that have gone repeatedly to the IMF, none of them have been able to stick with the policies purely because they don't understand what's good for them? None of these cases have worked? Come on, that is ridiculous.
Vietnam bad examples?
So they are examples of having done their own national policies, which diverts from what the IMF is actually recommending. You can't show me anywhere in the IMF where they are recommending to set up a development bank, to introduce industrial policies that promote manufacturing and promote exports specifically. All they want is trade liberalization and liberalization of markets in general, which is exactly the opposite of what countries like Vietnam and South Korea did to industrialize.
Arshad, from the perspective of frontier research, do you agree with that assessment of, this is what, there is a lack of agency on the part of ourselves as Sri Lankan citizens and from the people who are making decisions on our behalf in how they come up with
Is it also just a lack of agency or a lack of knowledge on how to drive this forward?
I think it's a two-way thing right now. I don't think we can completely put the IMF out and, let's say, handle things on our own, right? So because maybe from the drawn example...
I'm not talking about, withdrawing. I know that there are, like Kusum mentioned as well, there are some more sort of more on the fringe political movements that are maybe thinking of exiting the IMF program altogether.
Yeah.
Most in the mainstream are either talking about sticking with it or renegotiating, right? So within that framework, what I'm asking is, while we're working with the IMF, like Bram mentioned, should there be things that we also should be doing that are not happening? And that the reason that is not happening is because there is, as Niresh said, maybe a lack of capacity, but also a lack of agency and taking responsibility, accountability.
So I think I also broadly agree with that notion. And also, as like Bram said, there's been very, very little countries who've just followed exactly what the IMF says and has got out and done really well. So there've been most countries continuously following the IMF program and have also come up with their own stuff. So I think Sri Lanka also, just like you all pointed, I think we need to come up with something on our own. But again, the problem is because there is not much of space that the government can play with. Now, for example, if you're looking at, let's say now, if you look at the past, if you look at election years, we've seen governments play around during election years. We've seen taxes being cut. We've seen more spending in terms of the social side coming in. But that has not been the case, I would say, largely this year. So there is, I would again, broadly what I feel, there is, government should do something, but why they aren't is that they don't have much of space. And also with the new central bank act coming in, there's limitations on the money that you can print also. Now, past election years, you've seen the central bank printing money, using that to bring down interest rates, do things on their own. Again, not something possible right now. So it's that lack of space.
But for example, what Laszlo was mentioning earlier, right? I know your specialty is in economics, but on the governance reforms front, right? And this is where, I mean, I don't want to either lionize or denigrate the IMF, because the IMF is the IMF. It's an institution doing what most institutions of that nature do. But I do feel that as far as governance reforms go as well, the IMF is essentially paying lip service because they haven't mentioned any of that stuff in the review.
True.
So it's not conditional to Sri Lanka getting money that these reforms are passed, right? there's a diagnostic report was done, and it seems the IMF itself seems to have forgotten all about it. I don't think, as Mr. Lassell said, that we are deceiving the IMF on the governance front. But that kind of reform doesn't require a lot of financial space for the government to operate in. And that's one of the things that you could argue is not happening at all.
So I think in terms of, I think that's a good point, right? I think there was a study that the IMF also did in terms of governance and corruption. So they've looked at a lot of countries out there. So we've seen the countries where they've had good governance, low levels of corruption. There's been better growth. It has translated into better fiscal performances in terms of people voluntarily even paying taxes. So I think definitely that's something that that has to be looked into. The government has, I would say, taken small steps. There was the anti-corruption bill that came up.
The Anti-Corruption Act, I mean, several things that should have been rolled out by now have not been rolled out.
But then also, since we're speaking about the Anti-Corruption Act, Arshad, it's kind of sad to see that the Anti-Corruption Act is now being used as a tool to protect the corrupt, because this matter is sub judice, so I won't go to comment on the merits of the case, but what actually happened was there was action filed against a senior government official by the Bribery Commission. And of course, the indictments were signed by the commissioners of the Bribery Commission. And an initial objection was taken up, Nadeem, that the Bribery Commissioner has not been reappointed under the new Anti-Corruption Act, and therefore the indictments are invalid, and therefore they can't proceed against that. So again, acts that are being brought to combat corruption are now being used to shield the corrupt.
To quote Mr. Lassell, I don't think we're deceiving the IMF, we're deceiving ourselves.
Yeah. So again, right. So just to add, right, again, what I feel is just like you pointed out, bringing in one act is not going to make a difference, right? So if you're looking at governance, if you're looking at reducing corruption, you're looking at, let's say, a long-term sustained effort towards this.
On that front, the government has, I know it's not been gazetted yet, or maybe it has, I might be but there is a proposed economic transformation bill,
yes,
right? I'm sure research organizations like Frontier probably already looked at the draft text. So when you look at that, does that give you any indication of the direction that the government is heading in, or do you feel that even the economic transformation bill is just like another strategic development project that concentrates, like Kusum said, concentrates way too much power in specific and gives away a lot of discretion, more discretionary power than there is now?
So I think what the transformation bill, in fact, is trying to do is, I would say, to set a long-term path. Right, so they've been setting targets, saying, you need to get this, you need to get that.
But the targets of, I mean, you can't legislate we're going to have 5% annual economic growth. Even the IMF doesn't think that we're going to achieve that in the next few years. Like their projection for 2029 is 3.9%, something like that. So forget about targets. What I'm talking about is like the governance structure of the country itself, right, which needs to be fixed. We all know it needs to be. It has needed to be fixed from a very long time ago, for a few decades now, right? Since before either of us were born. I think even from before Nilesh was born.
Absolutely, long before that. Long before that.
I mean, on that front, even this economic transformation bill, at least from the little that I've sort of been able to study it, you might be able to give us more of an expert opinion. It seems that we're going down the same path of have more discretionary power to you.
True. I think I broadly agree with what you're saying also. And also these bills, these acts, right? They've set targets, like I mentioned before, but can those be actually achieved? And let's say the government doesn't achieve it, who's going to hold the government accountable? That is a big question. So does that really mean that these bills and acts doesn't have much power? Who's going to really question the government and say, what happened? Look here, what's going on? So that, again, is questionable. And again, these bills, acts, whatever that comes, can be overturned. So,
But Bram, just tell us a little bit about this wiping out corruption business. Is it at all feasible? I mean, can you really bring down corruption in a big way? Has it happened in any other country which is as corrupt as ours? I mean, it's all very well to legislate, but then actual on the ground, I mean, in the last 2 years of this government, do we see any lessening of corruption? I don't think so.
Well, from what I know, it's in the first instance very difficult to measure corruption. So how are we supposed to say it's more in one country, less in another? So what you can do is look at the impact. Now there, I think what people are feeling in Sri Lanka, which I also share that sentiment, is that the corruption, the impact is much bigger than it is in other countries. We can't say the corruption itself is more out of control, because I can name plenty of advanced countries where, it would be difficult to argue that there's not a lot of corruption there. So clearly that's not the determining factor. It's more the other way around. The problem is when you're experiencing economic weakness, that corruption is all the more a stranglehold on your economy. And what I think is the most detrimental form of corruption is really we come back to this problem of not having a nationalist economic plan and being, let's say, more guarded against influences from outside Sri Lanka that we all know have certain benefits, with Sri Lanka doing less well. So I think that form of corruption, if you want to call it that, would be my main concern. What happens in the country, sure, something should be addressed, but I don't really know about those details. All I know is that this is my take on it.
Brian, when you say economic nationalism, are you essentially arguing for like a form of protectionism?
It would do well, I think, for quite a few policymakers in Sri Lanka to look at the protectionism that is going on in the US and Europe right now. We're seeing all of those neoliberal ideas disappear like snow before the sun, with industrial policies all over the place and protectionism like you haven't seen in a long time. There's 100% tariff on Chinese EVs in the US, and this was not done by Trump. He just left it at 25%. Biden comes along and puts another 75% on it. In the EU, same thing. They've just introduced their tariffs against Chinese EVs. So where is the free trade gone?
Do you think that those policy measures that have been taken by the US and the EU against, let's say, China, Russia, post the invasion of Ukraine, but China definitely for a while now, you think it goes beyond sort of posturing on the global political stage and really into this is actual policy for the US and EU to promote protectionism?
Absolutely, because there's a recent article done by a Harvard economist and an Oxford economist, and they have shown that in the last 10 years, or I should say between 2010 and 2020, the advanced countries, meaning the US, European countries, and the other advanced countries, have introduced 30,000 new industrial policies. We are talking about not just tariffs. We are talking about subsidies for manufacturing. We are talking about trade credit. We are talking about concessional financing. The list goes on and on. You're absolutely right. It's a much broader strategy that they have now adopted, because they have realized that their manufacturing development is what is really important in the economy, and they've let that slip. They need to revive it because China is dominating them left, right, and center.
Sorry, I just want to bring Kusum in.
Yeah, sorry, there are a couple of things I wanted to pick up on. So first of all, this idea about national agency, which you all talked about, right? So, okay, I understand some of these IMF conditions restrict our agency, but there are a lot of things we still have agency over, like the governance aspect, okay? But what about the tax structure? So why is the tax structure so obtuse? Why is it still 80-20 in favor of indirect taxes? Why does Sri Lanka not have a top marginal income tax rate? So if you make 2 million rupees, you'll pay 36%. But if you make 6 million rupees, you'll still pay 36%. So there's no progressive taxation slab there. Corporate tax as a percentage of GDP is amongst the lowest in Sri Lanka amongst our region and income peers. And it's always been the case, right? So these are policy, these are actual political decisions. These are political choices. Even what I mentioned before about social spending to GDP. That's a political choice that we've made. We decided to prioritize other aspects over poverty and social spending. And over the last 20 years, we have decided to spend money on all sorts of things except education and health. So these are political choices, and these are policy choices. We talked about renegotiating of IMF programs. So just quickly, Argentina has renegotiated its standby agreement between 2018 and 2022. There was Pakistan that had an initial program in 2019. It was renegotiated post-COVID. Ecuador renegotiated an EFF agreement. Ukraine has negotiated several programs.
Cosmo, can I just quickly ask you on the subject of renegotiation? Is it the position, the official position of the SJB that if elected into power, they will seek to renegotiate the EFF?
Let me answer this question in a little bit of depth. So one of the issues that I think I brought up in my introduction was this idea of debt sustainability, okay, and what it means to us.
Yeah, and you mentioned the need to study the IMF's own debt sustainability models.
Yes,
and to see whether it has actually worked.
So correct. So if you look at this IMF program, what is essentially leading Sri Lanka back to is the international sovereign bond market. And I think Brahm himself has done a very good study on the impact of international sovereign bond borrowings on our total debt and our debt service. Because the problem is now, if Brahm's study was very good at that, he showed how bilateral debt was a larger portion of and IFI debt was a larger portion of our total debt, and how since 2009 the ISB amount has ticked up, and the largest increase was of course during the previous Ranil Wickremesinghe government between 2015 and 2019. That was on the explicit advice of the IMF to go into the ISB market and borrow funds to make a bridge that gap. Part of the reason they're giving us for this market access issue is that we are no longer we can't accept concessionary financing because we are now considered a middle income economy, right? So when you think about the IMF's debt sustainability frameworks, there's two. One is for middle income countries, apparently like us, and the other is for low income countries. So the article that I wanted to bring up is from the Financial Times from September 2023. So it's not very long ago, right? It's fairly, I told you the authors are both international financial economists, and I'll quote the first paragraph. There's a high risk that and they're talking about the debt restructuring, so it's very important. There's a high risk that this restructuring will not be thorough enough, leaving the country with a festering problem that will probably just lead to another default. This is a result of the IMF's bizarrely puny targets. Now, they are talking about our targets as being very easy to reach, but they're saying that based on our revenue targets. Our revenue targets are 15% of GDP, whereas even in the 90s, we had 20% of GDP. And a country with our structure should have closer to 20%. But even the IMF is telling us to go with 15, probably because we've been so terrible at raising revenue. But because we've been terrible in the last 10 years, is no reason to say that we can survive, or the country's poorest people can survive, if we have only 15% tax to GDP. The other problem that they bring up is that the fiscal adjustment alone, and I quote, the fiscal adjustment alone cannot reduce debt to sustainable levels. Debt to GDP was 128% in 2022 due to exchange rate depreciation, negative GDP growth, and the fiscal deficit. One of the main problems is that this IMF program doesn't give us a target for external debt stock, and I think you'll appreciate this. They say that our targets are unambitious from the point of view of debt sustainability, simply because they're thinking that we are a market access country. But they point out that when we last entered an IMF agreement in 2016 under the Ranil Wickremesinghe government, our external debt to GDP was around 60%. And they are expecting us to carry on like that. If you look at what our external debt to GDP is at the end of this program, it's still about 60%. By the way, by the end of this program, we will have more debt to GDP, we will have more external debt as a whole quantum than we do today. And by the end of the program, we will have roughly the same external debt to GDP than we have today. So primarily, we have to look at this where we started from, because what the IMF seems to have done is given us a certain set of targets and said, oh, based on this, you don't really need that much of a debt haircut. So in a sense, and also remember, our government gave the initial plan only for an external debt restructuring, not for a domestic debt restructuring. The IMF told us, no, we need a domestic debt restructuring. And the idea was, and this is also mentioned in this is not me saying it, they're saying that it was the domestic debt optimization seems to be fixing a problem that didn't really exist, because the problem was our external debt. It wasn't, and I've seen Brahm and several others make this point before, that we have been asked to take, the pension funds has been hit, and we've been asked to take a haircut on our local debt. What that's in effect doing is improving our debt service to our foreign creditors, right? So I'm not saying that this is an insidious thing that the IMF is doing, but we have to accept that the IMF is partly there to ensure that countries like us pay back our creditors. And who are our creditors? Some of them are bilateral, some of them are the IFI, but some of them are also private investors. And private investors want the largest piece of the pie as they can, right? So, and given currently we are in an issue where we have a problem with renegotiating a debt restructuring with our private creditors, because they all have different incentives and different wants.
What will be the SJB's means of handling? So I think you did hit on it. Our biggest issue is going to be with the private creditors, right?
Yeah.
Negotiating that.
Yeah.
We saw one of the main people in the SJB's economic team, Dr. Harsha De Silva, was not very happy with the proposal that had come from the side of the private creditors. Now you've got these big consulting firms that have been contracted by the government to go and speak to our various private creditors, the various investment banks, etc., Paris Club, etc., to come and to try and get a better deal. How much of a haircut do you think those private creditors should take? What is the SJB's position on this?
I won't comment on the value of the haircut, but I think what's being proposed is probably not going to be adequate based on the IMF's own projections. I mean, these are not my projections, right? The IMF's own projections are leaving us with more external debt than we have today.
If the SJB is, assuming the SJB is elected to power and you all get into renegotiating with both the IMF and sort of putting a bit more pressure on the private creditors, if that's a possibility, how many months or years would that set back the economic recovery process?
No, that would mean there is no setting back this. If we completely leave this process...
The reason that I asked that question is because even in Greece, when Sirasa, the left alliance, came into power, there was attempts made to renegotiate their deals with the IMF, ECB, and this is a Eurozone country. You know, they have their neighbors who also don't want them to crash because it makes their currency not worth the paper it's printed on. But even in that context, if there is an opinion amongst many economists that renegotiation process or the attempt to this thing definitely stalled the recovery process for Greece. Do you agree with that?
Do you recall that the IMF actually apologized to Greece and the Greek government because they accepted that their own solutions to the Greek economic crisis was actually exacerbated the Greek economy? In fact, the finance minister at the time, I can't remember his name, but he stated that in Parliament, Varoufakis stated in Parliament that he could predict with mathematical accuracy the period in which the Greek economy would crash based on the IMF's own projections, right? I can go into a whole monologue on the mistakes the IMF have made, from the financial crisis in the Asian region in 1997 to Ukraine to Greece. There's any number of them where the IMF themselves have come out. With Greece, they apologized. With Ukraine, they've mentioned a mistake that they made. With the Asian financial crisis, there's been a lot of IMF reporting that they've said they made mistakes on capital market liberalization for one, crony capitalism for another. So that issue is there. In terms of the SJB, the first thing, I think the SJB is probably the only party that keeps mentioning a specific marker for our economy, that is tax revenue to GDP. The NPP talks about tax rates, individual tax rates, corporate tax rates, VAT. Various other parties talk about your tax, my tax. All of that is irrelevant, right? And I just want to tell the audience, unfortunately, we are at the situation now where it doesn't matter if you think the Sri Lankan government should be smaller. It doesn't matter if you think your tax rate is too high. The fact of the matter is that we are in a program that we have to raise tax to GDP. And right now, we were at 9.8% as at end 2023. We might be at about 11% today. During the Yahapalana government, they passed the Indian Revenue Act 2018, and they had a raft of very progressive, actually for the time, tax changes to the structure. What did they achieve in those 4 years? Maximum of 11.7% of tax to GDP. So just based on that, the SJB will have to go for a much more equitable tax structure, but it will probably hit the highest earners a little harder. We have to raise corporate tax to GDP. I'm sorry if that's bad news for corporates and conglomerates, but that is the only way out. Okay, otherwise, you and I can pay VAT at another 3-4% higher, and the entire economy can contract further. And remember, if you're trying to raise tax to GDP, you have to also raise income, because tax is a factor of income. And if you're not going to grow, our income is going to be the same. So I think Neeraj and I discussed this World Bank report that talked about, what was it, the growth rates in Southeast Asia, which were estimated at between 5, 6, and 7%, on the average mainly propped up by India. We are being forecast at 2 to 3%. And the government has not given us any kind of industrial plan, any kind of plan for our exports, any kind of growth plan. So I think all of this is something that the SJB will address in their policy releases.
Just bring Lasil in, if I don't mind, because if you don't mind, just bring Lasil in on the conversation. Mr. De Silva, like I said, you mentioned earlier in your opening remarks about how, even the IMF has asked for it. And I think the three gentlemen on the panel with you, I think we've kind of established that as far as governance reforms go, maybe the IMF doesn't really care that much. It's not like the GSP Plus being tied to conducting provincial council elections, not that kind of situation. Here it seems to be more of a, you do this, but even if you don't do it, it's fine, we'll still give you the money. Do you agree that the IMF that we're not deceiving the IMF, we are in essence deceiving ourselves?
Actually, it's we should look at this way, the whole thing this way. Now, it is due to systematic state capture. Only there is so much widespread corruption. Like what Diresha asked, how do you stop? And are there other countries where they have been able to stop? Yes. Now, in order to do that, we have to establish a country where the rule of law reigns.
Yeah. But Mr. Lasser, I want to actually ask you this. You spent more than 30 years, I think, in administration.
37 years in Parliament.
So, because Bram brought up an interesting point on how you measure corruption, right? Like, for example, Transparency International has this index that it publishes every year. And the problem that I, for one, have with that index is that almost all of the countries, let's say the top 10 least corrupt countries in the world, are the countries where all of the oligarchs, dictators, autocrats from the rest of the world go and park all their money, right?
Yeah.
So there is corruption is not just a national issue. It does have a global sort of web now. In that kind of the kind of corruption that I'm sure you're talking about, like grand corruption, not petty corruption of like a police officer taking a bribe so that you get off paying a traffic fine. This kind of grand corruption, money laundering, etc., taking commissions on big projects, shuttling it off into shell corporations. How do we really measure that? How can you address that? Because the problem is so pervasive, not just in Sri Lanka, but around the world.
No, but we can't, on the whole, look at the bigger picture outside our country. In the first place, we have to concentrate on our whatever requirements to stop corruption. And for that purpose, like what I said, we have to understand why such a lot of corruption exists. As I said, go back again, state is totally, captured by the politicians. So you really need the political will to change the system. How do you, push them to sort of show the political will? Now, unfortunate situation is, let me go back again, in 1994, Chandrika came with such a lot of promises to stop corruption. Then again in 2015 also they did the same thing. Biggest problem, the political system itself. Look at, say, we will have to mention names. Look at most of the political parties, right? The political leaders in their parties, you don't see a kind of democratic kind of systems there. Now, when you don't have those democratic whatever, principles adopted in those political parties, how can we expect to run a democratic country for the benefit of the people?
So Lasil, this is a systemic
It's
issue.
a systemic problem
No
now.
matter which party is in power,
Yes.
and we have seen this over the past 20, 30,
Yes.
40 years.
Yes.
And in fact, the IMF recent report does speak of the systemic abuse of public power.
Correct, yes.
So it's in there.
And they speak of the need to have whistleblowers given protection, all that, right? Now, in order to establish a government where they have zero tolerance for corruption, this is an assignment that the people also should understand, because unless people change their mind in order to sort of, go and at least pressurize the politicians, that they have to change their system in order to, safeguard the interests of the public. Most important thing there, what I would say, all the time, they have even to
So,
go.
Mr. Lassell, let me ask, now, public pressure is definitely needed, right? There has to be public pressure as well if you want to, but there does need to be some sort of upstream, or one could argue that a majority of the work that needs to be done is actually upstream with the political leadership, because as you said, the system itself that is in place is corrupting.
Totally corrupt.
Right? So when whoever goes into it ends up being corrupted by the system.
Not
So
really.
how, now you get like various movements that have cropped up, the National Movement for Social Justice, there's, which was founded by Sobhita Hamudru, then there's various other groups as well. I'm drawing a bit of a brain freeze at the moment, but various other groups as well that have pushed for like various reform platforms, etc. But the public doesn't seem to be buying into this. Is the public happy with the state of corruption?
No.
Or they're just frustrated?
Aragale is an outcome, and that was the struggle. They said, end corruption in the sense that they want the money taken back and all that. But there again, they couldn't achieve their objectives, the goals, because it was again manipulated. So this is the problem that we have in the country. They don't want to sort of remove the kind of state capture. They will hold on now, even at the moment. Now, what happened? If not for the judiciary, it would have been terrible in this country, because nothing can be pushed for the benefit of the people. So what I am trying to say, it is very important to understand, unless the biggest problem again, unless you elect a better set of people, I don't know how
those
how
people
you...
themselves would end up being sort of sucked into this this kind of system. They'll be working with the same bureaucrats in the administrative service, in the education service.
I wouldn't blame the administrative service officials, because I have been even taking this discussion on number of occasions. Basically, it is the politicians, it is the parliament which is responsible to ensure that the corruption is stopped. Now, you have the court,
I can see
you have the
Kusum
PAC.
shaking his head next to you.
Pardon?
I can see Kusum shaking his head before you comment. Let me just let Mr. Lassell finish before you comment.
Yeah. Actually, look at what happens in the COPE. I have been in Parliament, I said, for about 37 years. Up to about 80s or early 90s, system was functioning a lot better than now. So what happened during the last 30, 40 years, even in Parliament, now Article 148 specifically says that they are responsible to take care of the public money. And Thomas Paine in 1770s, they had said, you should take such a lot of, with trust and, care. You should look after the public money. The problem here, we have also a system in Parliament where, unfortunately, they have neglected their duties totally. Let me tell you this way, like what we discussed about this Strategic Development Act. Can a Parliament enact such laws where you give out your responsibility to take care of the public money I'm in such a free hand in that way. So when these things happen, it's all because state capture, I would say it that way. What we really need at this moment, we have to understand the parliament totally has completely, or for that matter, taken control, by a set of, I don't know, they don't
Not
want.
so honorable gentlemen.
Mr. Silva, with those comments, I think
Yeah, I mean,
Kusum wanted
I
to add
agree
a
with
few. We'll
I
have to
agree
go
with
to the
my
final round
colleague.
right after that.
I agree with my colleague to a degree, right? But at the end of the day, when we talk about the 2016 period, that IMF program also told us to go for revenue-based fiscal consolidation. That was what is this, almost 8 years ago, right? So between now and then, how did a government come in between and say that I think cutting taxes might be a good idea? And when that manifesto came out about 6 to 8 months before the election was held. So there was enough of time for the bureaucracy, the professional class, the economists, the corporate sector to come out and say, we should really be raising our revenue. This cutting taxes is going to make our debts unsustainable. Can you point to a single commentary from that period that talked about this? No, nobody, right? And when they enacted it, when they enacted the tax cut, and our debt became unsustainable, and we collapsed, and we have to go to debt restructuring, have you seen a mass-scale resignations of bureaucrats from the finance ministry? Now, I was just mentioning a foreign publication, the Financial Times, and 2 foreign journalists that have talked about a very good faith critique of the IMF's internal deliberations and debt sustainability models. Have you heard that critique from any of the bureaucrats in the finance ministry? Has there been any sort of discussion locally about those things? No. These are kept away in a foreign journal and they're not discussed locally. So I think there's a lot of blame to go around, and I'm one of the first people to say that this parliament should have been reconstituted the moment Gotabaya left, because it's obvious that you're trying to bring about governance reforms, you're trying to bring about transparency in procurement, but you know the people that are in charge of the cabinet. You know who is constituting this government, and you know who constitutes this parliament. So how can we expect separate results? So then people will say, okay, if we go for an election, they'll just elect more of the same. Then so be it. But at least have that process and then hope that better people are selected. But you can have all the bright lights in parliament, but the bureaucrats have a part to play. The bureaucrats should have stood up and said, the governor of the central bank should have stood up and said, I don't agree with this money print. If that was the case at the time, Mr. Cabral should have told us what his homegrown solution was. But he didn't. He is also a political appointee. Who was the person below him? There was a number of deputy governors in the central bank. They are not all political appointees. Why did any of them stand up and say something? No, the fact of the matter is that bureaucrats, as much as anybody else, they said, let's not rock the boat. Let's take a back seat. Let's let the government do what it wants, even though it went against all the evidence.
The boat was sinking and they didn't want to rock it.
Yeah.
I have one more question for Arshad. Now, Arshad, it's been 2 years since, or more than 2 years since the bankruptcy occurred. I'm looking at the latest World Bank projections for GDP growth. And all of what we have been discussing and what the IMF has said in its report, none of that matters if we don't get proper economic growth to create jobs and, bring about the vistas of prosperity that we were promised to at one time. Now, the World Bank report, which came out last week, I believe, now 2024, the projection for Sri Lanka is a growth of 2.2%, while India is growing by 6.6%, and all of the other South Asian countries are in between, except for Pakistan. But Nepal 3.3, Maldives 4.7, Bhutan 4.9, Bangladesh 5.6. So we are down here at 2.2. This is more than 2 years after the bankruptcy. But now what's really of concern to me is you look another 2 years down the road, and the World Bank is forecasting, once again, India 6.8, Bhutan 6.0, Bangladesh 5.9, Nepal 5.3, and so on and so forth. Sri Lanka still languishing at 3.0. So even 4 years after the Aragalaya, we would be pretty much nowhere. Our, 3% is nothing when you're looking at the rest of South Asia and the rest of the world. So what's going on? We need the economy to grow.
So I think to start off with, right now, if you look at numbers that the IMF puts out, numbers that the World Bank puts out in terms of growth projections, I feel are very model-based numbers. So it's numbers that they input, certain numbers that they input and an output that comes. So I won't, let's say 100% agree saying that is the exact growth rate what we're looking at. I think the government has...
Obviously a give and take, yeah.
So the government has a little bit more optimistic value. And so in terms of, I think something that I also wanted to point out is, now if you looked at not the recent review, but let's say the past reviews out there. One thing in terms of Sri Lanka's GDP and all of it. Now we're looking at dollar terms GDP. So I think one main aspect in terms of also getting these growth numbers is figuring out where the rupee is going to look. It's because you're converting a rupee GDP into a dollar number, then calculating growth. So if you looked at, let's say, the past IMF reports, I don't think even the IMF expected Sri Lanka to have its currency come back and appreciating from its 360 levels. It wasn't explicitly stated, but when we did some numbers, what we realized is even the IMF expected Sri Lanka's, the rupee to, let's say, go to around a 400 level by the end of this year. And look here, we're right now at around 310. So it's based on that 400 number is where they came up with their growth projections. So there has been a bit of misalignment, right? So I would not 100% agree with these numbers, but yes, just like you agreed, I think growth has been low. And a main reason why I would point out is the slower pickup in private credit. So we've seen in Sri Lanka, there's a big correlation between private credit and the economy itself growing. Now, we've seen the central bank, we've seen so many economists talking about, look here, the prime lending rate has come down. But if you look at prime lending rate, the banks have mostly, what they've been doing is they've been parking most of their money in government securities. And also when you look at prime lending rate, it's the prime businesses that they've been lending to. But if you still look at, let's say, the small and medium-scale enterprises.
Which is more than 50% of the economy.
Right. So lending hasn't been going much towards those sectors. So I think...
That's because the interest rates are still too high.
Exactly. So there's been a bit of discrimination over there. So I think if things like that could be addressed, I think if credit starts growing, not just to the prime customers, not just simply giving money into treasury bills, if credit starts growing and let's say gives widespread across the economy, that could definitely be a driver. And I think where that has to kick in is from the perspective of the state banks. Now, if you analyze, let's say, the commercial banks in Sri Lanka, the state banks have been one of the biggest lenders to the private sector. But right now, if you look at BOC, People's Bank, with their capital buffers, with how the situations, how they've been facing so far, are not doing that great. And also we saw the IMF saying also the government has 450 billion allocated for bank recapitalization of the state banks. And hopefully should come in somewhere towards in August. And I feel that could be a kick-starting point. Suppose this bank recapitalization comes in, state banks become much more stronger, and that could be something that starts this lending cycle. And supposedly the state banks start this off, we might see the other banks also getting involved, and that should be a drive. And also we've seen measures in terms of this credit guarantee scheme, the ADB coming in, right, putting out 50 million there to promote loans for the small scale and the medium scale enterprises. That kicks in, I think we're in for
But that's a lot of ifs.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Arshad. I think with that we'll have to close the round for the questions from our journalists. But Arshad, since you spoke about state banks lending, I mean, I think without any prejudice to any specific state bank, I can tell you personally, Arshad, getting a loan from a state bank.
Oh, but if you're a member of parliament yet,
that was going to be my very next comment, Kusum, and I could also one-up you on that and say that if you're a member of parliament or in the right books with those in parliament, you can not just take a loan from a state bank, you can default on that loan and be rest assured that they will write it off as a bad debt. With that, we'll get into the closing round. I'd like to start with Bram Nicholas, economist. Bram, we've been speaking about quite a broad topic today about where Sri Lanka's future lies as far as the economy is concerned. Bram, you've been quite grim on the path that we're on. You have your own suggestions. You say that we need to make a drastic shift in how we are moving forward. But judging on the current trajectory of things, it seems as if Sri Lanka would stay the course. Even the major political parties who are vying for power are not very drastic in their changes. Nobody is really saying that we're going to dump this entire program and start afresh. So is there really no hope in progressing on the current path that Sri Lanka is on? You only got 2 minutes for your closing statement, so I'd make it snappy.
I guess there's a bit of hope. I think considering what I said before about the overwhelming evidence now we are getting from the advanced countries and their push to, let's call it reindustrialize, the industrial policies coming out thick and fast, together with the fact that in Sri Lanka we see the industrial sector having suffered the worst out of all the sectors. It's down 25% in constant prices from before the crisis. Okay, it's down by a quarter, and I think that weakness, together with what my colleague on the right here said about the issues in the SME sector, that weakness is forcing policymakers to relook at the course that Sri Lanka is headed in. Now, one example of that is the president, I think it was today or yesterday, said in an event that one of the things he would like to revisit is a national development bank. And I thought that would be one of the critical steps that Sri Lanka has to take, because as he rightly said, the success factor during Premadasa's time, from 1990 to 1994, President R. Premadasa, was actually the two development banks, the DFCC and the NDB, that provided the credit necessary to start up the 200 garments factories. This is our president saying this, and this is why he is also now thinking seriously, apparently, about reintroducing a state development bank, pointing at Singapore as the example that they developed their manufacturing sector with a development bank. So I think that would be one of the critical steps in the right direction. I hope they actually take it seriously and go ahead with that plan.
Thank you very much, Bram Nicholas, economist, for that closing statement. Moving on, we have Arshad Ismail, economist from Frontier Research. Arshad, you had more of a positive view about Sri Lanka's ongoing program with the IMF. We spoke about how Sri Lanka is dealing with the IMF. Are you hopeful that Sri Lanka, with its current efforts going on and whatever steps that we're taking right now, we will be able to reach a deal with our creditors, be it bilateral or private creditors, at a time before the IMF thinks, well, this is not working out, tata bye, we're gone?
All right. So in terms of, I think, timelines, to start off with the external debt restructuring, I think there's a few things that we need, right? So on one end, we need an MOU with our bilateral creditors. We need an agreement in principle with the bondholders. The main thing that has been delaying this is on the scenarios of the macro-linked bonds. The IMF is saying, look here, Sri Lanka's GDP is going to be low. Sri Lanka, therefore, needs a higher haircut. The bondholders on the other end are saying that, no, look here, Sri Lanka GDP will grow. Nominal GDP is going to grow. So we are only going to give Sri Lanka a much lower haircut. So there is a bit of a debate where the government and the IMF says, look here, we want a higher one. The bondholders saying this. So that's what is right now causing the delay. So hopefully, I feel the final terms in terms of how this restructure would play out is probably a compromise from both ends. You're not looking at the IMF getting their exact deal or the bondholders getting their exact deal. And then in terms of timing, my broad I had, let's say before, is some deal to come through towards June, July. But again, the question is, if you're not going to get a deal, let's say in June or July, to what extent would the bondholders or any creditor would be willing to deal with a potentially outgoing government with an election very, very near. So because if you're not going to get in a deal to, let's say, June, July, I most likely feel that there is no deal that's going to happen in 2024. Because you're looking at an election, let's say, in 1 or 2 months. The whole point would be, I would rather stay and negotiate this with a new government that comes in. So yes, like you said, there could be things. So right now what the IMF also, initially what they had as a target was to get these agreements by the second review. So now they've pushed it, saying that, look here, at least get it done by the third review. And again, the timing of the third review is also something that's questionable. So right now, technically it's set somewhere towards October, November, and with elections and all playing out, there is a possibility of that also being delayed. But broadly, I feel Sri Lanka in the upcoming months, hopefully something by July. If we're not going to get something by July, at least by, let's say, early 2025, if we can get through, stick through the reform process. There's definitely going to be bumps along the road, right? There's going to be elections, there's going to be the EDR finalization. There is going to be bumps, but I think if we can be disciplined enough, have good governance, lower corruption, Sri Lanka, I think, is headed towards the right direction. So I'll end it with that.
Thank you very much, Arshad Ismail, economist from Frontier Research. And now my attention to Lassel De Silva, former Director of Administration in Parliament. Mr. De Silva, now you've been Director of Administration in Parliament, and you've spoken much about discipline and how parliamentarians should be held to high standards. Been in Parliament for so long, and then with your practical experience, now we're doing a lot of things as far as policy is concerned. We're having these intellectual arguments about how we can get rid of corruption. But I think in this room, you'd know best if this is practically possible. So in your expert opinion, Mr. De Silva, do you think it's practically possible to try and whip some discipline in and get rid of most of the corruption that is plaguing Parliament right now? At least, let's give it a time of maybe in the next 20 years. Do you think it's possible, practically?
Yeah, it is certainly possible. Now, all what we need, not only discipline, state building, that is creating and strengthening the institutions to take the country to, achieve economic growth, political stability, all that. Unfortunately, it has not been done. Now, he was also telling the officials should take the responsibility. Unfortunately, again, since 80s, it is the politicians who make all the appointments, secretaries, everybody. So there is a problem. They are all linked up and they are doing it together. If the secretary also doesn't cooperate with the minister, they will even be thrown out. So what I am trying to say, the entire system has...
Mr. De Silva, are you saying that, it's not right for a bureaucrat to go up against a politician or to stand up for what is right if he is facing a threat of being thrown out? I mean, I wouldn't call it unfair because everybody needs some form of income to make ends meet.
Yeah.
But do you think that's the standard that should be set?
Usually these are two different jobs. The politicians should decide the policy. Actually, the officials, the public officers, execute all those policies. Now, what happens? They have created a system where everybody, even the public officials, should do what they want, because the Constitution, Article 52(2) says, the minister, now 52(1) says the secretary is appointed by the minister, the president. Now, the Article 52(2) says the secretary shall work in accordance with the instructions or all that of the minister. So this has created a big problem. That has created total politicization of the system. Now, there should be room in the 60s and early 70s, before the introduction of the 72 Constitution, right? A public officer was able to say, no, I'm sorry, this is wrong, you can't do that. Now you can't say, you will be thrown out. So what I am trying to say, the politicization started from the 70s and we have ultimately ended up in a situation like this. We have to depoliticize the whole system. That is where the political capture is. If we can definitely try and sort this mess out, like in, now see, we had the same system like in Canada, Australia, UK. Our system now is none of those, whether it is French or I don't know. Now, all that needs to be resolved. You asked me whether it is possible. Certainly it is possible. How do you do that? Basically, maybe changing the whole thing to create a structure, institutions where you should be able to, take the country forward to achieve all that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lassel de Silva, former Director of Administration in Parliament. Finally, we've got Kusum Vijaythilaka, Working Committee member of the Samagi Janavala Vegya. Kusum, there are a lot of promises going about. The Samagi Janavala Vegya also is contesting the presidential election. Sajid Premadasa is the presidential candidate. Judging by what's happening right now, we're speaking about a deal with the creditors, the bilateral creditors and the private creditors as well. I think Arshad said that we might have a deal in July, we might have a deal at the start of 2025. Just to pick your mind on this, if you could maybe address this in your closing statement. I know you got a limited time, so if you can, would the SJB prefer having a agreement with creditors and private and bilateral by July, or under a government of the SJB if they are elected? If you could maybe address that in your closing statement. Your time starts now.
Certainly the SJB would prefer to have some say in the future debt restructurings, but it also depends on what kind of deal is on offer. If there's a decent enough deal, the faster we get this done, the better, right? But I think there's probably not a lot of people in my party who think they can probably get a better deal out of this, right? So I didn't have time to go into some of the other issues regarding this, because one of the things we can do, because this debt distress is not unique to Sri Lanka. There's multiple countries that this has happened. I didn't see a good faith attempt by this government to meet the finance ministers of the other countries and sort of go in together for a negotiation, right? Now, some sort of a class action style negotiation with private creditors, because nobody wants a default. This is too much debt. They can't afford a default either. I mean, we can't afford a default, but neither can they, because they need their money back to some degree, right? So I think there's a little more agency that we have in that negotiation than is perhaps can be seen at the moment. We talked about what is possible, right? So anything's possible in the future, but we should look at what is probable. So I agree with my colleagues, political capture, I agree with institutional building, I agree with the IMF reforms. Sure, we have to broadly get these IMF reforms going. I agree with governance reforms. Debt sustainability, fine. So let's say we stick to this IMF program, we reach this supposed debt sustainability by 2032, 2033, what then? Because our primary problem has always been our trade deficit. So if we don't fix our trade deficit and we don't change the structure of our economy where we are so dependent on foreign financial flows and foreign currency borrowings to basically quench our thirst for dollars for imports, and we have the same export base that we have today without diversification, without high technology exports, how are we going to grow? So how are we going to grow if we have the highest energy costs in the region? If the average consumer is paying the highest for transport, the highest for electricity, the highest for water, roughly in the region, who is going to come and invest, financial capital, manufacturing capital, industrial capital in Sri Lanka? What kind of returns are those investors going to get? So let's be real. I mean, this current path might take us, the IMF's own languages, we are on a knife edge of debt sustainability. So if you're on a knife edge, we're just as likely to fall off the knife edge as we are to complete the project.
Either get cut in half or stabbed.
So let's say we achieve all this. I still don't see any movement in the long-term prospects of our country, because if we don't shift towards an export-oriented, industrialist, high-technology economy, we will be back here in 5 years' time and we will have once again these conversations about the IMF and debt sustainability. So the SJB has proposed an industrial plan. We have an export FDI plan, and it will be presented soon. And I hope people take a look at it, because there's a lot of things we can do to improve the current situation. Thank you.
If I may, Charlotte, just one comment.
Yes.
The phrase knife edge appears in this IMF report in several instances, and it struck me as highly unusual in a report of this type to have a phrase like that repeated over and over again.
Maybe even it could be a warning saying, if you guys mess up, don't blame us. Thank you very much, Kusum Vijaythilaka, member of the SJB Working Committee, for joining us on our program. Thank you very much, Lassel de Silva. Thank you, Arshad Ismail and Braham Nicholas. for taking the time off your busy schedules and educating, of course, the general public on these matters of public importance. Thank you very much to Niresh Aliyathambi and Nadeem Majid for asking all the right questions. Thank you very much to all our viewers out there for tuning into another episode of Face the Nation. We will see you same time, same place next week. Until then, take care and God bless.